Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master and the product owners are communicating while they build their backlog and they groom their backlog to get all of the requirements and get well-written stories. So ideally, the team should be able to sprint on these stories. They should not have to go outside of their team to ask questions because the stories are going to be well-written. When building a team, typically the first thing that folks think about are the developers. If you have a team where developers, you have an A personality and a B personality and they don't necessarily get along, typically what will happen is they'll kind of separate the work out and they'll kind of go off into their corners and do the work, and there's a little bit less collaboration. So it's very important in my past, I made it a big point to really think about who's going to be on the team, what their skill sets are, whether or not the team members are willing to what I call cross-contaminate and collaborate. Those are important factors, especially when we're bringing on, if you're going from a classic situation where the QA staff were in a separate area and the developers were in a separate area, maybe even on a different floor in the office building. It's kind of the developers say we're done and they push it out to an environment, and then the QA send off emails saying that nothing is working, you just wasted 3 hours of our time, and then developer says, okay, try now, and then, and QA always, they always get, at the end, they're trying to hurry up and test everything, and they get rushed because, of course, senior management wants to deliver. And that's the thing that we totally want to get rid of, and that's what we do with Agile. So, but going back to the team dynamics, taking QA members away from that situation and sitting them next to developers and putting them into a smaller team and co-locating them. Even if you're a distributed team, co-locating can be done virtually. Obviously, we can use tools like Google Hangouts and Skype. There's collaboration wikis and Jira and issue tracking systems and things like that. But the main thing is to make sure that you have a dynamic team where the QA members on the team are willing to learn things, like learn about unit testing and vice versa. Because, the classic thing is devs should not be testing, that's my job, and vice versa. So we want to try to make that be clear that when you create a team and they kind of sign that Agile contract that they're going to be doing Agile, that they agree that they will collaborate and there will be no hand in the, putting out the hand to say that I'm not willing to do testing or do development things. So the difference with QA and an Agile team is, there are unit test tools, whether you're doing Java or Ruby, that are kind of geared towards QA. So QA can, if you're a non-programmer type person. But the main thing is that if the team is doing test-driven development, the first thing that they're going to do is kind of look at their stories, and they're going to start to probably work on what data do we need from a development perspective. And then the next thing they're going to do is they're going to start writing test cases or test unit tests. If they're doing Ruby, they're probably going to use something like RSpec. And when if you look at an RSpec unit test, it's actually readable even if you're a non-developer. Because there's little sentences in there that say this should do this and this should do that. And this is the part that is good, an initial start for testing, because first the tester or the QA folks on the team are going to start. They were involved at the very beginning when the product owner and the Scrum Master were building the backlog, because they're looking for testing criteria. They're looking for gaps, essentially gaps in the requirements, things that need to be tested. So now that they have that knowledge and they come into the team and they start the sprint, now they're able to sit down with the developer and they can watch and maybe even participate in when these unit tests are being run. These unit tests are going to be continuously integrated into the build process. So as the sprint is happening and they're iteratively developing, they're going to be writing these tests, and they're going to pass and they're going to fail. So as the QA person gets to watch this and maybe even get involved in pair program as these are being written, they can also see the results and know the results, and then based on that, they can cover any gaps with their actual test cases that they're running. The other thing that I wanted to point out is typically QA are very interested at the beginning. If we step back to a waterfall process, they're interested in acceptance criteria. So again, before the sprint even starts, it's a great thing for the QA member to be, or QA members of the team to be involved in the scoping of the stories, because typically developers are going to scope stories based on the development tasks. Having a QA, this is just making the Agile team better. Just think about if they were not on the team, it would be, you know, they could be off severely in scope. So they want to look early on at acceptance criteria and the scope of each story, and participate in the estimating process. And then, of course, once the backlog is groomed and prioritized, and the items are moved into the sprint, and the sprint is executed, the QA team members bring that to the table right off the bat. So again, when the developer starts doing test-driven development and writing unit tests, the QA person can correlate what the acceptance criteria is, and whether or not the unit tests are making all, you know, the test coverage may say it's 98% when they run the tests, so you get a report back. But there may be some gaps in there that the QA folks can cover in their testing. So cross-training and multifunctional. To say that QA folks are going to become developers is probably not true. But to say that QA folks are going to get and learn new things and be more a part of the process. Those are the most important thing about Agile, is that there's collaboration happening, so there can be an iterative, because you're going to take whatever you're developing or whatever you're trying to deliver. It's, instead of taking long, you know, requirements documents or use cases, you're breaking it down into smaller pieces. And so there's this constant feedback, and it's constant feedback from these unit tests that are being run, the continuous integration and build process. So testing is happening all during the sprint. It's not, let's test at the end. So the ability to be multifunctional and to cross-train over a period of time means that probably what you're going to see is the sprint team, if they were, let's just say it's a new team, the first couple of sprints, probably you're not actually going to meet all of the scope. You're going to be a little, you probably want to shoot to be under what you think your capacity may be as a team. The reason for that is because you want things, first of all, you want the sprints to be successful. So you don't want to start off trying to do too much to make it not successful. Two reasons for that is that you want the team to feel successful, so that, you know, they feel like they're making progress. But the other thing is you don't want, especially if Agile is new in your organization, you don't want it to seem like it doesn't work. So you certainly want to set yourself up to win, so to speak, on the first couple of sprints. By doing that, you're going to see also that the team dynamics and that multifunctional and that cross-training is just going to keep building and building on itself as the team becomes more integrated. And this is why when we plan the teams and we choose the folks that are on the team, it's so important, because what we want to see is we want to see an increase in capacity of the team. In other words, they can take on more things each sprint up into a certain point. And then also that their velocity is going to get better. In other words, they're going to get faster, because there's going to be things that, you know, maybe the development's bogged down a little bit because there's a lot more on them. They have to write these unit tests, they have to do test-driven development, they have to write the code, and then of course if there's any bugs during the sprint, they have to fix those. But as the team starts to become more dynamic and more cross-functional, and cross-trained, the QA folks can maybe even write some unit tests, or they can participate in it, or they can, help organize them and determine what unit tests need to be written based on what the initial code specs are. So I think, is there a next slide after the multifunctional?
Yeah, before that, I would like to share some experience in my team. That my team is kind of like we were doing the project in a traditional methodology, and then we transformed to agile methodology about years ago. And then it seems to me, as the project manager, the whole team just like a new team. I mean, our tester doesn't wait until the end to test, but we start share our ideas and suggestions in the initial phase right after the user story come out, and then we can write up some very basic test cases to contribute our understanding on the user story. And also, we are not only provide daily reports, like how many defects that we found and how many defects that we verified, but we also provide some testing status for the new features or the updated features. Those kind of information will really help the whole team to get more accurate information to make further decision for the stakeholders, the PO. Mm-hmm. So it's really, I mean, it's really change. And, like you mentioned that the cross-training and the multifunctional, I mean, also that the tester is not only test, but they also share their idea with the developer. So they have to develop their knowledge so that they can communicate with the developer, because the QA and the developer actually, they may speak in English, but they will just speak in different language. I mean, the developer tend to speak more like detail level to the technical things, and the QA are more like functional or business oriented information provider. So mm-hmm. It really develop each side, just like what you mentioned, that multifunctional.
Right. You covered two good points actually. So again, the QA members of the team and the team itself, when they start to do planning, the team collaborates around the design and the initial tasks that are required to implement each story. And you talked about the folks that are not on the team and how do they get information, because one of the things we do not want to have is drive-bys and interruptions for the team. The team needs to focus on the sprint. So we want to put in place information radiators to radiate out the information. So in other words, what's in the sprint, what is the status of each story in the sprint throughout the sprint.
Yeah.
And so as the QA members work with the team, I'm going to stop saying QA members, but I'm going to start saying the sprint team. They collaborate around the design and the initial task. They get these stories in place. They start to include and start to design tests and creating the tests and the tasks. So now they're collaborating on not just creating development tasks for each story, but test tasks, acceptance criteria for each story, and all of these things, whatever the test automation is, the exploratory testing, the integration testing, all of these things can be dashboarded throughout the sprint. So outside folks looking in can verify and see things as it's happening without having to ask questions or have status meetings and things like that.
Yeah, because I mean, those QA, they were working in a traditional way of the testing, and they suddenly changed to an agile mode. It's really uncomfortable at the initial phase. Mm-hmm. So my team almost like take half to 1 year to, to turn into agile mode. And do you have any experience in or see the other team, how long would they take to do a transformation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so typically with Scrum, the way, if you're following the real process, the teams are self-managed. My position was always either a director of development or kind of managing several agile teams. So I tried, I certainly did not get involved other than the planning sessions and the Scrum sessions, and I let the teams run their own Scrum sessions. So what I did do, though, is when planning the teams is try to figure out what would make the most dynamic teams and grab skill sets, for whatever the team was going to focusing on. Like if the team was focusing on refactoring an existing application, or if the team was focusing on working through a backlog of issues or bugs or new features that maybe they could not get to otherwise, I would kind of pick the right skill sets for those teams. And then sometimes even have a floater, what I call a floater, where there might be somebody with knowledge of all systems that would kind of cross across teams during Scrum sessions to look for gap analysis or impact areas. But once you figure you get the team set and they start sprinting, it's usually 3 to 4 sprints before they start to really synchronize. And once in a while, if being that they're self-managed, if a team member decides that this just isn't for me, or maybe they don't get along with somebody on the team, then maybe you have to move somebody from one team to the other. It's very rare, but it does happen once in a while. But once you have a team where they're all kind of synced together and they get along, it's amazing how much faster and the better quality of work that can be turned out.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think that will be a very there will be a very painful period. I totally agreed.
A little bit, yeah. I call it the you got to pay a little tax up front, to get things. And it's not just about the team. You got to have the tools in place. The next slide is talking about the different types of testing. So, in order to unit test, you have to have your unit testing framework in place. You probably want to have a continuous integration server, so as they're doing development, you're getting constant feedback from the code commits that are happening. You're getting, in other words, they commit code on a Monday and unit tests start failing. You need to have that constant feedback, and to the point to where information radiators could be in hallways, or anybody could go see, are their builds successful yet? On Wednesday, it looks like all their unit tests are passing, and I can see that these 3 stories are being developed and these 2 stories are completed. All of that information can be radiated out to the entire company just with tools. That's one of the things I do, is help with tool sets. So typically you're going to start off with unit testing. The QA folks are going to do the initial QA feature testing and the acceptance criteria and the planning and the actual, if you're going to do automated testing from a QA perspective or manual web testing, you're going to declare bugs with whatever your issue tracking tool is. Those will get assigned, and integration testing will be happening. I just spoke about that, where as code is happening, there's this continuous integration going on. So you finished a couple stories, they're integrated, you've done all that, you've done your unit tests, you've done your QA tests, and everything seems to be passing. Then you move on to the next story, and then you implement something that maybe touches something that was previously developed in the sprint. And of course, then we go into the regression testing. So you're going to have as far as unit testing is concerned, they're being run all the time, so there's really no regression. But with QA on the team, they're going to be doing regression testing as the sprint moves forward, especially if a bug was completed or whatever. So there's still going to be that. But it's test first, code, continuous and then continue to test in all respects throughout the sprint. Because what we don't want to happen is we don't want to have the sprint come to an end or almost to an end, the last 2 days of the sprint, and then we test, and then you run into all kinds of problems, and then you're not going to meet your goals.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. For the unit testing, you know that in practice, not many software projects have the luxury of unit testing. You know, so yeah, it's just as you said, there's no time for unit testing, and so it always gets ignored. And in most of the situations, that unit testing require a lot of effort. So
yeah, that's true. It's definitely a different mentality even for the developers, and it's kind of like once you start doing it, it's awesome.
Yeah.
But a lot of developers just want to start coding right away and kind of, you know, do the classic, I'm going to code now and I'm going to kind of test as I go myself. And that's okay, and it can still work in an agile environment, and you can still, the QA staff on the team can still do testing up front. The thing that we don't want to happen is that the QA folks are just sitting there waiting for something to be coded. You know, there's things that everybody should be kind of collaborating and working on various stories in some way from day one until the end of the sprint. And so that's why test-driven development and unit testing kind of is good, because you know, the QA folks can get involved in that aspect. They're already involved in the pre-planning and the scoping and all of that. And you know, for web development, which is, you know, typically the case these days, test-driven development is probably not as seen. It's not seen as often. But if you're writing like web services or things that are kind of back-end, it makes a ton of sense to do test-driven development, because you can start testing things, you know, that you write your code right away without having to go to a browser and go through a URL and kind of do this manual thing. It's much faster. And actually, if you're doing Ruby and Rails or any of the newer technologies, it's almost built into the framework. It's, you know, it's usually some sort of unit testing framework is built in. So.
Yeah, so the tools actually help, and it's only the tools that are available then the developer are willing to code the unit testing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is sometimes it's difficult to ask the developer to do the unit testing right away, because yeah, you mentioned that there's no instant feedback for them. I mean, right away to see how the unit testing serves, and
right.
Yeah, so they probably just actually, as a QA, I understand that very well to some extent, but I mean, one of the solutions in my mind is that comparison. I mean, in the team, there will be a lot of developers, and we can just facilitate parts of the developer to do mandatory unit testing, and the other developers they don't require to do unit testing, and then the developers who do the unit testing will maybe gradually convince the developer who doesn't do the unit testing, and that may help. I mean, in a team, so that instead of having the manager in developer's mind that the manager doesn't know the technical detail, who's not easy to convince the developer to do the unit testing, which is cost their time and effort.
Right. So so there's two ways to kind of go about integrating the team into this kind of process. If the developers are not, they traditionally have not been doing test-driven development and not really writing unit tests up front. Again, this depends on the technology that you're using, and I'll just focus on Ruby since it's kind of a popular one these days. If you were to look at an RSpec test, really what a QA member could write the test without having any criteria in the test. Because again, when we first started planning and we looked at the stories, the team is collaborating and they're looking at the scope of the stories. So everybody on the team knows what the stories are and what the requirements are, and what the acceptance criteria is. So it would be easy for anybody on the team to start writing these RSpec sections, and they're just all going to pass right away because you're not putting any criteria. You're essentially writing stories like, this should get a bunch of people. This should get 0 people back, and it's kind of, you're writing little quotes, and this again is RSpec for Ruby. And by doing that, that helps the developers. They can look at these tests and say, oh, I need to write this because I have to pull back people, and I have to write this because I have to pull back banking information or whatever. And then again, the other aspect is maybe QA is just going to look at results. They're only going to look at unit test results. That's the total of their involvement in it. Still, again, as a team, they looked at the stories, they looked at the scope, they agree on what the tasks are, they built out the tasks. So as the developers unit testing or even writing code and looking at results of the code as it's being written, maybe they're doing manual testing through a web interface. They could collaborate and have the QA doing that at the same time. So it's kind of more of a manual unit testing or a manual testing. That's another option.
Yeah, so you think that QA, just from 2 aspects, that reading the unit testing code or review the results of the unit testing. So yeah, I think that would be wonderful. I mean, at least for some of the QA, they don't have programming background, so it would be very difficult for them to, start to use programming tools like JUnit or NUnit. Those tools kind of very overwhelming at the first time.
There are actually tools out there that are geared towards QA to be able to write unit tests. There's one called, I believe it's in one of the slides. It's for Java. But can I share my screen? So just real quick, I just wanted to show an example of, this is just an example unit test. And this is for Ruby. This is actually RSpec. So basically, you can see that if I wanted to, or if the QA person wanted to, they could just simply write these. So they would say it should return a web plan, because we have a story where we have to enable a user to create a web plan. They need to sign up for a web hosting plan, right? So you could write, the QA member of the team could write these, should return a plan. It should return some sort of web plan. There should be one that's found whenever an ID is passed in. So then after that's done, then the developer could, after the developer is done writing their code for each one of these things, because this is going to help them do that, then they would be able to come in and fill in the blank, basically essentially fill in the blanks. And then as they do that, so these tests would all be passing when it didn't have these parts in them. And then the test, they would enter these in, and maybe they would get some fails, and so then they would go in and make the corrections in the code until they passed. Sometimes you want them to fail on purpose. But this is in Java with JUnit, it's similar. And TestNG, some of the newer, well, TestNG is not that new, but it's similar, maybe a little bit more complicated, but.
Oh, so it seems to me this is kind of like a test-driven development. So it looks very exciting. I mean, like for those less programming experience QA, maybe we can just start from the comments in the unit testing, the code. Then we try we try to go further. Then we try to go to the test logic. We try to go to more detailed level, like to test the data structure and the logic of the condition. So that's correct. Yeah.
And that now the QA folks on the team are becoming much more integrated into the team, right?
Yeah.
They're more integrated into the development process. They're more familiar with the actual objects in the code base and the data, which you need to be anyway. So here comes that cross training and that what I call cross contamination of skill sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then also this extreme programming with the QA and the developers sitting together, it seems to me it's more practical. I mean, sometimes the extreme programming is using for the user, the real user, the end user, and the development team. So they're sitting together, and the user just telling their requirement, and the developer just do coding to implement it. And it's just it won't be that practical to have a real user sit it by, but the QA are willing to do that, and as a real user role in a team. And the extreme programming, including QA, and also will let the developer describe their understanding on the feature, and then maybe the misunderstanding will be reviewed. And then
that's correct.
At this point, and in your screen, it looks to me that it's like test cases, which actually is a document.
That's a good point, yeah, because I've seen large QA teams write some serious test scripts that were very complicated, and so our spec is no more complicated than that. It's as far as the code in between, that's okay, because that can be filled in as we saw. It's really it's initially getting the structure of what unit tests are going to be required, and you could just creating the files themselves in the right directory, in the RSpec directory. Or the spec directory.
And also, it reminds me that the QA involved in this unit testing and into a very detail of the implementation for a function or a method, that also will help the new hired developer. I mean, those developers, especially for those very complicated systems, very business-oriented, those systems, the new hired developer really need help from the QA who understands the whole system. So
right, the testers can often, if they're not actually helping with the writing of the unit tests, the first thing they're going to do is help the developers evaluate their unit test coverage. So they're going to help them, because you can make test coverage get up pretty high, but it may not be actually testing everything. So it's good to have the QA looking at that, for looking at the results for gaps.
Yes.
And so then also it goes back the other way. The developers can then help the testers write more tricky test cases.
Yeah, it is. Some corner cases. So to make actually make the system stronger.
I think we can go back to the slides, or am I missing something? Let's see. Do you see the slides?
Not yet.
Hold on one second. Now you should see it because I'm actually going to show the last couple slides. Do you guys see the cross training slides?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
we're about to open it up for Q&A. Extending XP to testers, even if, again, the tester's not writing unit tests and maybe they're not quite doing full-on test-driven development, having a tester pair program and do extreme programming is just going to make them more familiar with the process, more familiar with the code base, and it's just going to enable them to write better test cases, at a minimum. I guess one of the test collaboration tools that I had was trying to think of the name of is called Test Mentor. It's a little bit dated, but it's still in heavy use, and it's Java. It's geared towards Java, but it's basically kind of like a unit test framework where anybody on the team can write unit tests, and they'll essentially they get converted into JUnit tests. And we talked about obviously QA and test-driven development and removing skill sets and inhibitors so everybody can kind of learn from each other and become more dynamic as a team. Because one thing about Agile that I see all the time is they'll start a sprint and they'll assign things to individuals, and they treat the Agile process as tasking individuals. It's not tasking individuals. You're setting up sprints for a team, and it's up to the team to manage themselves, and it's up to the team to manage how they handle the tasks. And that comes into the team dynamics aspect. So I'll open it up for questions now.
Hey, Mike, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it clear, or am I breaking up again?
You sound fine to me.
Okay, great. First question I got in the middle of the webinar was, what are your thoughts on QA and dev sitting in the same room while doing unit tests?
Absolutely. If you're doing Agile at all, and you're not a distributed team, they should be in a single space. It's called co-location. It's
okay.
Extremely important. Extremely important. And I actually had about 35 developers that worked for me, and we had 2 stories in the building. And initially, the developers and QA were in completely different areas. And in the bottom floor, there was this wide open space that the company was not using. So I did a lot of fighting to get that space, and I moved every Agile team into that space. I got all new furniture, enclosed basically sections of the whole down space. We threw in couches and all kinds of comfortable aspects to the room to make it kind of fun to be in. And at first, there is a little bit of, whoa, there's going to be a QA people sitting next to me, and they're going to be looking at what I'm doing. But once that team starts to get dynamic, and once they start to collaborate and they work the stories, it's awesome.
JD, what are your thoughts here working in distributed teams? JD, are you still there?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. What are your thoughts on QA and dev sitting in the same room for unit testing, working in a distributed team?
Yeah, actually, I think that distributed team can also work in this unit testing, because we can use. Actually, we have like some tools like TeamViewer. You can see each other's screen and work in parallel, and both of the side will have the control. And also, because my team kind of in a different time zone, So there will be some time overlapping. Then we will use those times to share each other's idea, which may not be very easy to communicate in an email. And also, for the team, the QA will develop their information communication skill to get the information communicate more efficiently. That will be also another key to get the successful unit testing in a distributed team. And also during the unit testing, and I would like to, I really would like our QA member to understand some programming knowledge. Then it will be more easy to communicate with the developer.
Okay, great. We still have about 5 minutes left, so I'm sure we cannot cover all questions. The ones that we can't cover now, we'll try to get back to you via email after the webinar. Mike, we got a question from Jean Ann. How can coverage tools help?
Well, obviously they help depending on which ones you're talking about. So there's, trying to think of the name of the one that Atlassian has. But all of those types of tools should be integrated into what's called the tool set for your team, and that's something also that anybody on the team, whether they're QA or a developer, could participate in. So, typically what would happen is when you look at test coverage, I don't know why I can't think, oh, it's called Clover, sorry. Which is, one of them is called Clover from Atlassian. There's another one, the Crucible is another one of their test tools. But basically, during the code review process and the initial development and the initial unit test development, they can look at the test coverage and use things like Clover, and there's some other ones out there as well. That's kind of our spec. Will give you a coverage report as well as to how much coverage you have for your unit tests. It'll tell you a percentage. And you obviously want to get up to the high 90s.
Okay. And you guys talked a bit about the pain in getting started with unit testing, but the results at the end. We got a question from Janet regarding the cost factor, which everyone is thinking of probably as well. Mm-hmm. Would you guys care to expand on that?
As far as cost goes, there's two kinds of costs. There's the cost of taking more time to deliver things, which is the opposite of what we want to do. The other cost is the cost of the tools themselves. It used to be that cost was high for tools. If we look at Quality Center and we look at a lot of the IBM products that we would use in the past to do things like this, to do test coverage and unit testing and development in general. But these days, all of these things are much more cheaper, if not free. If that's what the question was about.
Yeah. I think so. And I think we have time for one last question.
Seconds.
I think I'm on the speakerphone. Now it's better, right?
I think it is.
How about test data management?
So again, we come back to the tool set. As far as test cases that the QA folks are going to be running alongside of, and then of course any type of integration testing that's going to be run manually, all of those results can be stored in. It's not to say that you can't use a test harness or test tools. So if you are, obviously your test data is going to be in those tools. But if not, you can do write your test cases, attach them to or link them to any stories, depending if you're using tools like Jira and Greenhopper or Raleigh, using Raleigh, any of these agile type project management tools where you're tracking your stories and bugs and issues. You can have your test data linked to the stories themselves or the tasks where the testing is occurring.
Okay. Mike, you were echoing a little bit.
Yeah,
I think I'm not sure what happened. But I think maybe we should break it up. And I'd like to thank you, Mike, a lot. Thanks, JD, as well.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and you will get an email tomorrow where you can find the recording and the slides. And again, later in this month, we're holding 2 more webinars, and I hope to see you guys there. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at services@xbosoft.com.